He was supposed to be unconscious, hooked up to machines, unresponsive, forgotten in a private hospital suite. Yet every day, the same young nurse whispered to him about the weather, about his estranged mother, about a family betrayal no one else dared to mention. One afternoon, she said something she wasn't supposed to say, and that's when he blinked. If this story stirs something deep in you about truth, trust, or second chances, stay with us. And if it feels right, like subscribe or share a thought. Some stories deserve to be felt, not just watched. Redwood Private Medical Center stood just west of downtown Chicago, its polished marble lobby reflecting quiet wealth and a promise of discretion. On the 5th floor, behind a double layer of security doors and frosted glass, was room 511, a private suite reserved for the city's most powerful, the kind of room that never showed up on public floor plans. Inside, the world seemed to hold its breath. Grant Whitmore lay still beneath pristine white sheets, an oxygen line beneath his nose, IV lines running from both arms. To any observer, he looked like a man deep in coma, peaceful, preserved. But Grant was awake, and had been for 4 days. He didn't remember the crash. The last clear image was the hotel boardroom, Logan slouched in his chair, Vivian sipping espresso, papers spread out like a war map. After that, just flashes, metal, screeching, black. Then a room that smelled like antiseptic and betrayal. They thought he couldn't hear. On the second day after his admittance, when the blinds were drawn and the afternoon light turned amber, he heard Logan's voice, low but sharp. "We can't wait too long. The policy says if he's unresponsive for 7 days, we can initiate the removal request." "Don't be crude," Vivian said. Her tone was soft, almost maternal. "It's not about money, it's about dignity. Grant wouldn't want this, lying in that bed, unable to move or speak." Grant felt something burn behind his eyes. Anger, slow and deep. He'd trusted them. Vivian had been married to his father for 12 years. She helped raise him when his mother died. Logan was a cousin, close enough to call brother once. But now, in the hush of the room, they were making arrangements, talking timelines, contingencies. They left before visiting hours ended, their voices fading down the hallway. Silence returned like a weight. Machines beeped, steady and unfeeling. Grant lay frozen, trapped in a body that had become both prison and witness. He began testing himself. Could he move anything? A toe, a finger, a breath he could control? Nothing obvious, but if he focused, really focused, sometimes the tip of his left index finger twitched, just once, enough to tell himself he was still in there. The nurses rotated in and out. Most were polite, some efficient to the point of coldness. None lingered until Elise Monroe. She came on shift like someone who didn't fear stillness. Her voice had weight. She didn't speak to him in sing-song or whisper, just a calm, respectful tone that never presumed anything. The first time she took his vitals, she said, "If you can hear me, I won't ask you to prove it, but I'll treat you like you can." That made something stir in him. Not physically, not yet, but something real. Elise was in her early 30s, black hair always tied back, movements clean and deliberate. She didn't smell like perfume, just soap and the faintest hint of coffee. She called him Mr. Whitmore. She didn't flinch when adjusting his trach line, and most importantly, she stayed a moment longer than necessary. On the 4th day, while replacing the dressing near his collarbone, Elise paused. Her hands stilled. And then, almost like a thought escaping out loud, she said, "You know, I don't think you're supposed to be here like this. I've been doing this job too long not to feel when something's off." She looked up, studying his face. "I saw your file, the brake failure, the pre-existing clause in your health directive. It's convenient." Her voice dropped lower, meant only for the man she believed couldn't hear. "I don't know why you're holding on, but I hope you do. I really do." Grant concentrated. Left hand, one finger, a single, deliberate twitch. Not a spasm, not a fluke. But she was already tossing the used gauze. her back turned. Still, that moment became a crack in the wall around him. He waited for her next shift, like a drowning man waits for shore. When she returned the next morning, humming under her breath, he knew he had something she didn't time. He began to listen more carefully. To the staff conversations, to who checked which chart, to when Vivian called the hospital. Every small detail became part of his survival. And always, he watched for Elise. That afternoon, she sat on the edge of the bed briefly, checking oxygen levels. "I'm not supposed to tell you this," she said, "but there's a meeting set for Friday. It's about your directive. Some of the family is pushing for withdrawal. Just thought, well, I don't know why I thought you should hear that." She smiled faintly, then stood. After she left, Grant tried again. He opened his eyes. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Blurred light, ceiling tiles, but it was something. He was still here. The hallway light in Elise Monroe's apartment flickered when she opened the door, the way it always did when the wind blew in off the lake. She tossed her hospital bag on the kitchen counter, kicked off her shoes, and opened the fridge, only to close it again. Her dinner, still in the paper bag from the corner sandwich shop, sat untouched on the table, but her eyes weren't on it. They were on her laptop, already open, the screen still glowing from earlier. She sat down slowly, her name badge still clipped to her scrubs. The search history was exactly where she left it. Grant Whitmore accident details. She told herself it wasn't about curiosity. It was about ethics, concern for a patient. But deep down, she knew it was more. There was something about the way Vivian had spoken, not like someone grieving or even scared. It was cold, measured. Elise clicked on the first article. Grant Whitmore remains in a coma following a single vehicle crash on Lakeshore Drive. Initial reports suggest brake failure. Investigation ongoing. No external trauma reported. Brake failure. On a 2023 custom Range Rover. She read it twice, then leaned back. Something wasn't adding up. She opened another tab and started searching court records. No police report had been filed for the crash. Private hospital, private investigation, private silence. But why a man like Grant had layers of security, surveillance, legal oversight. Yet no one outside his family seemed to be talking. Her stomach tightened. She remembered too well the way Logan had looked when he came to the ICU, how he didn't glance at Grant once. Only checked his phone, spoke to the administrator, then left. Vivian's visit was shorter. She didn't ask questions. She signed something and left behind a bottle of imported hand lotion for the nursing staff. Elise had worked at enough hospitals to know what that meant. She opened her contacts, scrolled. Her thumb hovered over one name, Alicia Dwyer, an old friend of her mother's, now a semi-retired insurance attorney. The last time they spoke was when Elise was still in school, begging for help to overturn a denied claim for her mother's hospice care. She never forgot Alicia's voice on the line. "The system doesn't bend for people like your mother. Elise, it only breaks us." Elise didn't press call. She closed the phone, pulled her knees up to her chest, and stared at the wall. At that very moment, in a high-rise overlooking the loop, Logan Rivera stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, sipping scotch. Vivian sat behind his desk, flipping through a slim leather folder labeled Temporary Financial Delegation, Whitmore Holdings. "All we need is Dr. Harrow's signature," Logan said, glancing down at his Rolex. "And we'll be in the clear by Friday." Vivian didn't respond. She simply looked out the window. Her reflection caught in the glass beside the skyline. He was never meant to survive that crash. Logan turned. He survived too much. That's always been the problem. The next morning, Elise entered the medical supply room just after 10. She had meant to restock IV kits, but stopped when she heard voices low, pressed, too close to ignore. She recognized them instantly. "He doesn't have long. If the board signs off, they can initiate the withdrawal order," Logan said, and if someone asks questions, Vivian's voice, taut but steady. "No one's going to listen to a nurse, especially not one on a short-term contract." Elise didn't breathe. She slowly backed into the shadow of the shelving unit and pulled out her phone, thumb sliding to the voice memo app. She hit record. The rest of their conversation was brief, technical, ruthless. When it ended, She slipped the phone back into her pocket and waited until the footsteps faded. Then she stood still for a long time. She walked back to her cart and finished her rounds like nothing had happened, smiled at a visitor, checked a monitor, adjusted a blanket. But everything had changed. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, listening to the recording. Every word was clear, every phrase sharp. She didn't know if it would be enough, but it was a beginning. She looked out the window, toward the dark skyline. She wasn't just a nurse now. The morning air inside room 511 felt heavier than usual, as if something in the air itself knew what was about to shift. The blinds were halfway drawn, letting in a filtered Chicago light, dull and sterile, casting faint shadows across the tiled floor. Machines blinked in their rhythm. Everything about the room looked still, but Elise Monroe's hands weren't moving out of routine today. She stood at the left side of the bed, checking the IV ports with deliberate slowness. Her phone sat face down on the tray table, voice recorder already running. She hadn't told anyone, not her colleagues, not the floor manager, not even herself, fully, what she hoped to find. But her gut had been speaking louder than reason for days now. Grant's face hadn't changed, still slack, still pale. But there was something in the muscles near his jaw, just enough tension, just enough presence that kept her circling back. She leaned in, her fingers brushing his chest as if adjusting the blanket, but her mouth was near his collarbone. "If you can hear me," she whispered, "I need you to try something." Her voice was steady, but her palms were clammy. 1 time for yes, 2 times for no. Just your index finger, left hand. Nothing happened for a full 10 seconds. She closed her eyes. Then it came, a movement so slight, she almost doubted herself. 1 twitch, clean, controlled, not random. She jerked upright, heart hammering. Her eyes flicked to the monitor. No change, no alarm. But she knew what she saw. "Okay," she said softly, barely breathing. "Okay." She asked another question. "Do you know what day it is?" 2 twitches. "No." "Do you know who I am?" 1 twitch, yes. And then another, a pause, and 1 more, like he was correcting her, clarifying. Elise stared at his hand, stunned. There was consciousness behind that skin, inside that body. Not just memory, but now, awareness. Before she could react further, there was a sharp knock on the door. Logan's voice followed, muffled, casual, just checking in. He didn't wait for a response. His silhouette passed the glass window, then disappeared. Elise turned the phone face down again and exhaled. That knock had yanked her back into a reality where this entire interaction, this proof, meant nothing unless someone else could see it too. Downstairs, in the administration wing. Vivian sat across from the medical director. The room smelled of leather and soft cologne. She held a black pen, poised over a document labeled Preliminary End-of-Life Authorization. "The neurologist's report says there's been no meaningful change," she said, "and this would only initiate the first stage of the hearing." The director replied. Vivian signed. "Let's not drag this out. He wouldn't want that." Meanwhile, Elise stood in the records room, flipping through an unorganized stack of legal notices meant for another floor. One sheet stuck out, stamped with a seal she didn't recognize. It was addressed to the hospital director from the office of Miles Carter, Grant's longtime legal advisor. Her eyes scanned the dense legal language, then stopped. Any decision regarding medical care, power of attorney, or a corporate delegation must not be altered or reassigned under any condition unless reviewed by civil court. Signed prior to incident. Elise's hands shook slightly as she folded the page and slipped it into her coat. She wasn't trained for this, but she had seen enough to know that people like Vivian didn't wait unless they had to, and people like Logan didn't hesitate if they thought no one would stand in the way. She returned to room 511. Grant's face looked the same, but the tension had changed. The set of his mouth, the way his fingers curled faintly near the edge of the blanket, it was different. She took his hand again, gently. He didn't move this time. Maybe tired, maybe waiting. She didn't say anything, just looked at him for a long moment, She knew what this meant. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The clock on Elise's kitchen wall ticked past 9:30 when she finally sat down. The overhead light flickered once. Weak from the wiring, she kept forgetting to report. Her dinner still boxed, sat untouched on the counter. She opened her laptop, clicked through half-read medical journals, old patient notes, and then paused. She typed in a name, Whitmore Community Health Grant, 2013. The search took seconds. One link led to an archived photo from a local community event, Grant Whitmore in a gray suit, standing next to a podium, eyes downcast. Behind him, a line of young scholarship recipients, all in their 20s, all in borrowed confidence. Elise stared at the last girl in the row. The hair was shorter then, her shoulders thinner, but it was her. She clicked to enlarge the photo. It wasn't the sight of herself that stopped her breath. It was Grant just slightly off-center, not smiling, just watching. And then she remembered. The girl next to her had whispered, "That's the Whitmore guy, but he doesn't talk at these things. It's his stepmother's project." Vivian had stood at the microphone, thanking donors, naming herself as the architect of the program. Elise had believed her, until now. She opened another file, her mother's medical records, a scan of a rejection letter, denied end-of-life care extension not covered under current policy. It had arrived 1 week before her mother passed. Elise had thrown it across the room when she read it. What she hadn't known then was who had later approved the anonymous emergency fund that paid the final bill. Now, she wondered if it had been him. She clicked back to the photo. Grant's eyes in the image weren't on the crowd. They were looking behind the curtain, toward the wings, toward the place Elise had run to after receiving the rejection letter in person, trying to hide her tears. She felt something stir, something old and sharp. She remembered the ache of being seen, just for a moment, and then dismissed it like so many other moments when help came too late. She stood and grabbed her bag, then paused, turned back, and printed the photo. At the hospital, the late shift had settled into its rhythm, soft hallway lights, distant monitors. Most of the staff assumed she was catching up on charting. No one asked why she returned. Room 5111 was dark except for the light above the bed. Grant lay as he had that morning, silent. Still, Elise walked in quietly, closed the door behind her, and took the photo from her coat pocket. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him. "You were there," she whispered finally. "You saw me, and I think you helped, somehow, even if I didn't know it." She placed the photo gently into his hand, folding his fingers around it. "I remember now, that look in your eyes, it wasn't pity. It was like you knew what it meant to lose something too early." She sat beside him for a moment, letting the silence stretch. "I didn't thank you then, but I won't make the same mistake twice." She reached down, touched his wrist lightly. He didn't move, but then slowly, unmistakably, his index finger curled once. Her breath caught, her throat tightened. She didn't cry out, didn't speak. She just sat back and let the weight of the past settle into place. Later, in the elevator, her reflection caught her off guard. Her eyes looked older, harder. Not sad, not angry, just clear. She stepped out onto the main floor without a sound, walking past the security guard, past the vending machine humming quietly in the corner. Outside, the wind had picked up, leaves scraped across the pavement. She didn't look back, but something in her had already turned. The copy machine in the medical library hummed faintly as Elise stood beside it, her eyes fixed on the printed documents sliding out one by one. Pages from the Illinois State Business Registry, public filings on Whitmore Grand, amendments to shareholder authority made in the past 3 months. Most nurses didn't spend their breaks studying financial footnotes, but Elise wasn't just a nurse anymore. She didn't fully know what she was looking for, but every column she highlighted, every clause she reread, told her something wasn't right. Transfers of partial rights, emergency proxies signed by a neurologist who hadn't seen Grant since the second day of his coma. The signatures were too neat, the timing too clean. No one reviewed estate documents that quickly unless they were preparing for something final. Back at the hospital, she adjusted her badge and took the side elevator to avoid questions. Her break was over, but the weight in her chest hadn't eased. She pushed the door into room 511 and exhaled as the familiar hush of monitors wrapped around her. Grant lay motionless, as always. But now, every twitch of his finger, every minuscule breath shift, meant something else entirely. They had built something in that quiet code, a thread. She walked over, closed the blinds halfway, and pulled up the rolling stool beside him. Her voice dropped low. "Vivian," she said carefully, "did she orchestrate your crash?" One finger moved. Once, Logan paid off Dr. Harrow 2 fingers. "Elise." He twitched again. Once. She nodded slowly. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with clarity. A new shape had started to form, one she could trace through whispers in legal paper. She kept asking questions, one by one. Grant responded, finger by finger. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Like building a bridge across a canyon, one stone at a time. Later that afternoon, Elise stood at the ventilator console, her hands occupied with tubing that didn't need checking. But she needed to say it. "My mom died when I was 17, she said quietly, not looking at him. Stage 4 liver failure. She came to this country believing if she worked hard enough, America would take care of her." Elise paused. The rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator seemed louder in the silence, but the hospital said she didn't qualify for coverage because she was late on renewing a form. Just one form. Her voice caught. "So I watched her die, day by day, knowing if she'd been born 10 blocks west, she'd still be here. She didn't expect anything in return. She wasn't talking to get comfort. She just needed it spoken aloud, this old wound she never let see the light." But then, something shifted. Grant's hand moved, not just a twitch, but a slow tightening. His fingers closed around hers. Elise froze. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't part of their code. It was connection. She looked down at his face. His expression hadn't changed, but something in the stillness felt different now, as if the wall between them had cracked just enough to let air in. She didn't pull away. She stayed there a little longer, letting his hand hold hers, her thumb barely moving over his skin like a memory. Meanwhile, across the building, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass, Logan Rivera held a leather folder between 2 fingers like it offended him. He handed it across the desk to Vivian. "Sign it. The board meets on Thursday. If we get this filed, we'll bypass probate and have emergency control before the end of the quarter." Vivian didn't move right away. Instead, she tapped the pen against the folder's edge. "Are you sure about Harrow?" "He's already in," Logan said. "And if Miles Carter tries anything, we'll discredit him. You know he has his own conflicts." Vivian didn't answer. She looked out the window instead, watching the faint outline of an ambulance pulling into the ER bay below. "Just don't let Elise push further," she said finally. "She's observant." Logan smiled. Observant is easy to discredit. But Vivian didn't smile back. That evening, as Elise stepped out of room 511, she kept her hand curled just slightly still, feeling the imprint of his fingers. And though her shift had ended, she didn't go home. She walked toward the admin wing, with a copy of the shareholder memo tucked into her coat, heart heavy but steady. The hallway outside the hospital pharmacy was quiet, but Elise waited an extra second before pushing the door. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly above rows of antiseptic shelves and beige cabinets. She walked to the far end of the room, past the tall unit labeled wound supplies, and pulled a sealed white container from the bottom shelf. Behind it, nestled in the hollow of the cart rail, sat a microcamera the size of a button, black casing, voice activated. She placed it carefully, then slid the container back in place. Her hand lingered for a moment. She wasn't sure what scared her more, being caught or not catching anything at all. The device would only activate when voices rose above background noise. If they whispered, it might miss. If they stayed quiet, it might fail. But it was the only way left. Her shift was uneventful until noon. Patient stable, no questions. But her mind ran parallel to every chart she updated. Every step she took toward room 511 felt heavier than the last. She entered and closed the door behind her, her laptop tucked under her arm. Grant lay still, his face unchanged. But Elise had learned to look differently now. She saw the faint tension in his brow, the slight curl of his fingers, subtle signs that he was aware. She pulled up a chair and placed the laptop on the rolling tray, opened the file marked Voice Memo 07. She slid a single earbud into her left ear. Static. Then a quiet ripple of hallway noise, followed by her own voice from earlier. "If I get enough evidence," she whispered, matching the rhythm, "Miles Carter will have grounds to delay the hearing. But I need confirmation. Someone on the board's compromised. Is that true?" Grant's left finger moved. Once. "Is it Dr. Langston?" 2 twitches. "No." Deputy CFO, 1 twitch. She stopped breathing. The picture sharpened. The line that had once been suspicion was turning solid. "I can't prove that unless I get more than this," she said softly. "They'll say I'm guessing. I need something on tape." As if summoned by her doubt, her phone vibrated inside her scrub pocket. The subject line flashed on the screen. "Upload complete, 12:47 p.m. She didn't open it right away. She just stared at the words, her pulse climbing. Back in the staff locker room, she locked herself in the corner stall and opened her encrypted email app. The first thumbnail loaded slowly, a still frame from the pharmacy feed. Vivian was seated, her hands folded, no makeup, no pearls. Just a woman who looked tired and deliberate. Elise pressed play. The timestamp read 12:13 p.m. Vivian's voice came through, clipped and sharp. "Logan, if you push the end-of-life paperwork through by Thursday, I'll transfer 3% of the board shares to your name. The rest goes to me." Elise didn't exhale until the screen went black. Her throat burned. It was no longer about a theory, no longer about trying to piece together whispers in sterile rooms. This was clear: financial motive, strategic intent, a planned execution of power under the mask of mercy. That evening, she returned to room 5111. The lights were dimmed. No monitors beeped loudly, just the low sigh of the ventilator and the steady sound of filtered air. She sat again, close. "I got it," she said, "and it's worse than we thought." He didn't move. Not at first. "I know what this means. Once I send this to Miles, it's out of our hands. I won't be able to walk this back, and they won't forgive me." She reached forward, her fingers brushing his hand gently. "If I do this, I'm not just risking my job. I'm putting my name on the line, my license, my life, maybe." A long pause, then a single, steady twitch. Her hand closed around his. This wasn't about loyalty anymore. It wasn't even about duty. It was the first time in a long time that Elise Monroe felt like she wasn't standing on the sidelines of someone else's story. The whispers started on a Tuesday. They began as glances, 2 nurses pausing mid-sentence when Elise passed, an orderly adjusting his tone the moment her name came up. Then came the murmurs behind her back, subtle but growing. By the end of the week, even the charge nurse had taken to watching her from the nurses' station just a second too long. Elise said nothing. She kept her gaze steady down the halls of Redwood Private Medical Center, clipboard in hand, smile practiced but distant. She had grown used to being underestimated. But now, she was being watched. At lunch, a respiratory tech leaned in across the table and whispered, "You know who Vivian really is? Right, second wife. The one who got the trust, moved over in '09. She basically owns the board." Elise didn't answer. She just took another bite of her apple. "You're messing with someone who's used to winning." The tech added, "Be careful." That afternoon, her name was called over the intercom, "Nurse Monroe. Please report to Executive Office 3. Nurse Monroe. Executive Office 3. She knew what that meant. Vivian Whitmore didn't summon people lightly. The office was at the end of a hallway rarely used by clinical staff. It smelled like old carpet and wealth-polished wood, expensive air diffusers, the kind of silence that made you straighten your spine. Vivian stood when Elise entered. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice smooth like a museum guide. "Please, sit." "Chamomile." Elise shook her head. Vivian poured herself a cup anyway, graceful even in threat. You've been a committed nurse, Elise. Patients speak well of you, especially Grant. Elise watched her, waited. Vivian stirred her tea. I understand that certain rumors have been circulating about my involvement, about Grant's care, and I also understand you've shown an unusual amount of concern. Elise tilted her head. Concern doesn't need permission, does it? Vivian smiled, slow and cold. Sometimes it does. When that concern edges into interference, you're bright. Elise, you should know what happens when people cross boundaries they don't understand. Elise kept her voice quiet. I understand more than you think. Vivian leaned forward. Grant's body is being kept alive. That's all. He's not coming back. And frankly, even if he could, what life is that locked in, trapped in a shell of power he never really earned. His death could mean peace. For him, for all of us. Elise met her eyes. And if he's listening to every word you're saying right now, Vivian froze for a breath, then lifted her cup. Then I hope he's grown enough to understand the burden of legacy. Surely he'd rather release it. She set the cup down softly. You strike me as someone who's survived her own weight. Choose wisely, Elise. We all have to. Elise rose. I've made my choice. Vivian didn't stop her. That night, Elise returned to room 511. She didn't turn on the light, just stood at the foot of the bed, breathing. She moved closer, checked the IV lines, then reached for his hand as she always did. His fingers were cold, but familiar. Steady. I met with her. She whispered. She wants me to believe you're better off gone, that your life is just weight now. But I've seen what it means when people give up too early. I've lived it. There was no sound in response. She brushed his hair gently from his forehead, as she had every shift since the day she arrived. Then, as she turned to leave, she paused. Behind her, a rustle, a whisper of breath. She turned back, his eyelids parted, only slightly, barely more than a flutter. But it was enough. Their eyes met his unfocused, but alive, hers wide with the weight of everything unsaid. She didn't speak, didn't dare. He closed them again. But something in the room had shifted, something impossible to undo. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The 21st floor conference suite of Redwood Medical Tower rarely hosted urgency. Most of the time, it was reserved for board retreats, fundraising debriefs, or quiet discussions over catered lunch. But that morning, the air was heavy. A long mahogany table stretched under soft ceiling lights, bottled water lined up like soldiers. At one end, Vivian Whitmore stood, posture perfect, voice smooth. Grant has shown no neurological progress for weeks, she said evenly, hands folded. Per Illinois statutes, the family has the right to file a request to withdraw artificial support after 7 days, provided medical confirmation. This is not just emotional, it's a matter of dignity and estate responsibility. Nods circled the room, men in pressed suits, gray temples and measured blinks. Only one of them, Dr. Hirsch, shifted in his seat. Vivian continued. As co-trustee of the Whitmore Grand Holding Group, I moved for the hospital's legal consent to proceed. A beat. Then the door opened quietly behind them. Miles Carter entered first composure wrapped in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand. Behind him, Elise stepped in. She wore no badge, just a slate gray sweater and plain pants, her face calm but alert. She didn't flinch when the board turned to her with confusion or something colder. I'm Elise Monroe, she said. I've been Grant Whitmore's assigned care nurse since the 3rd day of his hospitalization. Vivian's expression didn't change. This is a closed session. Miles held up a letter, as legal counsel retained before Mr. Whitmore's accident. I've submitted a notice of emergency proxy concern to the Ethics Review Board. Per state law, new neurological activity is grounds for re-evaluation of decision-making authority. Dr. Hirsch leaned forward. You're saying there's brain response, Elise took a breath. We recorded consistent voluntary finger responses. Left index, 1 press for yes, 2 for no. Pattern matches suggest comprehension and engagement. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small black drive, plugging it into the media port. And this, she said, voice steady, is a private recording of a conversation between Mrs. Vivian Whitmore and Mr. Logan Rivera, taken on hospital premises. No one moved. Then the audio played, Vivian's voice, cool and contained. If we fast-track the termination, you get your 3%. The rest goes through me. We'll have a clean board vote before the lawyers make a mess. Gasps didn't come, but glances flicked, fast and sharp. One of the directors leaned away from Vivian. Another folded his hands tighter. Elise stood quiet, not adding anything else. The silence was louder than the recording. And then one more sound. The door creaked. Shoes tapped on tile. A cane struck lightly. Once, then again. Heads turned slowly as Grant Whitmore entered the room. He looked thinner, a faint tremor in his hand. But he walked, supported, upright, dressed not in silk or suit, but a dark cardigan and slacks too loose around the waist. He met no one's eyes until he reached the end of the table. Then he spoke. Nice to see everyone still has their appetite for business, he said quietly. No one responded. Vivian didn't move. Her face held still, but her hands had frozen above her notes. Grant turned to Elise, nodded once. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But she stepped back, letting him have the room. Vivian's lips parted, perhaps to challenge, but Grant's voice cut through before she could. I'm not dead, he said simply, but some things are. And with that, he rested his hand on the table edge, steadying himself for what came next. The silence that followed Grant's entrance was louder than any outcry. No one stood. No one spoke. The only sound was the slow, deliberate tapping of his cane against the polished marble floor as he approached the head of the boardroom table. He looked smaller than they remembered. His frame was thinner, his face pale, lips slightly cracked. But his presence filled the room with something electric. A man once written off as legally unconscious was now here, standing, breathing, and unmistakably watching. Vivian's voice was the first to break. Grant, you shouldn't strain yourself like this. The doctors haven't yet cleared. My doctors, Grant interrupted, his voice raw but unmistakably firm. Or yours. He reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan and laid a small recording device on the table. The gesture was slow, but steady. The board members glanced at each other. No one moved to touch it. I know what you did, he said. And more importantly, I know who stayed silent while it happened. Vivian straightened, folding her hands in front of her. Grant, this is not the place. You've been through a trauma. No, he said, his voice rising just slightly. The trauma was listening to my own family, plan my death while I couldn't move. The trauma was knowing I was still here aware while you talked about my shares like I was a stock being liquidated. His words hit the air like fists. Logan shifted forward, eyes flicking around the room. None of us knew you were responsive. Elise. She manipulated Elise saved me, Grant said, his gaze locking on Logan. She risked everything when no one else even paused to wonder. She listened. And more than that, she believed. Miles, standing just outside the circle, didn't speak. But his presence behind Grant was undeniable. Several board members looked to one another, suddenly unsure of their footing. One of them, Director Hawthorne, cleared his throat. If Mr. Whitmore has regained cognitive function, any decision made during his incapacitation, especially concerning the termination of life support, becomes null. The legal path forward reverts back to him. Vivian's jaw tensed, but she said nothing. Grant turned slowly, scanning the faces in the room. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to take back what was mine. And if anyone here thinks I'm going to vanish quietly again, I suggest they reconsider. And with that, he pushed the recorder across the table. That's the last time my voice will be treated like it doesn't matter. He turned and walked out of the room. Outside, Elise stood by the wall, her arms crossed, not looking in. She had watched the whole thing on a discrete screen in the hallway, not because she needed to know the outcome, but because it reminded her why she came forward in the first place. She began to walk toward the elevator. No applause, no recognition. Then a voice. Isn't that her local news crew, stationed near the conference entrance for unrelated coverage, caught a glimpse? That's the nurse, Elise Monroe. Right. A camera swiveled toward her. A microphone was raised. A producer began moving fast. Elise didn't break stride. She turned her face slightly away, pulled her coat tighter, and kept walking. She wasn't here for the spotlight. Not now. Not ever. The building on East 79th Street was quiet by early evening, the kind of quiet that wrapped around narrow stairwells and peeled paint like an old coat left too long in the wind. Grant stood on the front steps with a small envelope in hand, wearing a coat too large for his frame and a stillness that didn't belong to a man freshly returned from the dead. He looked up at the third floor. No lights, no sound, just the door Elise Monroe used to walk through at the end of every shift, carrying the weight of someone else's life on her shoulders. She wasn't there now. Her name had been peeled from the mailbox. The paper label gone. Only a faint square of tape left behind like a scar. No forwarding address. No note. Just absence. Grant didn't knock. He slipped the envelope through the gap under the door and lingered for a second longer, his fingers grazing the cold wood. Then he turned and left, the sound of his cane tapping once, twice, fading down the hall. Inside the envelope wasn't money. It was something more deliberate. Pages from a spiral-bound notebook, the one Elise had kept next to his hospital bed. At first, it was just numbers, vitals, notes, reminders. But then came the voice, scribbled into the margins. Day 17. I don't know if you're listening. I'm not even sure what I'm doing here anymore. But the rain outside sounds like the one from that night. The one no one remembers but you. Day 42. They're trying to schedule the withdrawal again. I said no. I said I needed more time. I don't think anyone heard me. Each entry had a rhythm, small, honest, unfiltered. She had spoken to him like he was still there. And now? Grant read each line like a map, back to something he hadn't known he needed. Across the city, Elise sat on the edge of a worn armchair in a cramped kitchen. The pages spread in her lap, like a confession someone else wrote with her hands. Her eyes moved slowly over the ink, some of it smudged, some underlined, some hastily crossed out. When the knock came earlier that morning, she hadn't answered. But her mother, technically, her foster mother, though neither used the word, had opened the door and stood frozen for a beat too long. He hadn't said much, just placed a folder on the table. Inside were paid hospital invoices, the kind they never sent receipts for, stamped with the name of her mother. No charities, no foundations. Just a line at the bottom that read, cleared in full, G.W. Her mother had watched him leave through the lace curtain. He didn't come to explain. She'd told Elise over the phone, just made sure you knew the debt wasn't yours to carry anymore. That night, Elise moved to the window and slid it open. The fall air moved around her like a whisper too familiar to ignore. Below, parked across the street beneath a flickering street lamp, was a black car. No driver stepped out, no engine idled. But the lights were off, and the silhouette in the driver's seat didn't shift. Elise didn't wave, didn't step back either. She just watched, and somewhere between them, between glass and silence, something stayed. The garden behind St. Luke's community home wasn't much, just two benches, an uneven patch of grass, and a wooden trellis that once held roses, now overgrown with ivy. But it was quiet, the kind of quiet no hospital hallway could offer, the kind that held space for words too difficult to say indoors. Elise sat first. She didn't smile. Her posture wasn't stiff, just watchful. The white blouse she wore moved slightly with the wind. She didn't dress for a reunion. She dressed like someone who hadn't decided whether she would stay. Grant arrived 10 minutes late, limping a little, wearing no watch. The knee brace made each step deliberate. He didn't carry flowers, Didn't reach for a handshake. Just a simple nod, and a chair pulled slightly too far from her, then closer again. She didn't comment on his limp, and he didn't comment on the way she folded her hands in her lap and didn't unfold them for a long time. "Do you know," Elise said finally, "that it was your father who denied my mother's insurance appeal in 2007? Grant inhaled slow. Yes. She didn't flinch, but her eyes locked onto his. "I found out 2 years ago," he continued. "After he passed, I went through his files. There was a stack marked low-risk override. Hundreds of applications. I created a list and tried to make restitution, case by case, but not my mother's." "No," he said. "Her name wasn't Monroe. Was it?" Elise shook her head. "She kept her birth name. She didn't trust systems enough to change it." A long silence settled between them. Neither filled it. They let the wind pick at the ivy and the gravel crunch somewhere in the distance. Time moved, but slower here. Grant looked down. His voice came quieter. "You don't owe me this meeting. I know, but I needed to say, I'm sorry. Not on his behalf. I can't carry that. But for what I didn't see, what I didn't question, what I benefited from." "You didn't know me," she replied. "That's not the point." Elise studied his hands. They were paler than before, less certain. "After my mom died, I worked 3 jobs. I slept in waiting rooms and library cubicles. When I finally made it through nursing school, I used her name Monroe, not for pride, just to keep her alive somewhere." Grant nodded. "I remember a grant approved in your final year, through the hospital fund. I thought it was from a woman named Vivian. It was from me," he said softly, "but I didn't sign it with my name. Back then, I thought anonymous giving was noble. It's just convenient," she said. Her words didn't bite, but they didn't soften either. He accepted that. They sat a while longer. "Do you hate me?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "No," she said finally. "But I hate that I wanted you to be someone better. I'm trying," he said. "I know." Then she paused. Let her gaze drift to the sky. "I haven't forgiven you. I wouldn't ask you to. But," she added, voice nearly a whisper, "I haven't wanted to forget you either." He turned toward her. The moment wasn't dramatic. No music, no lightning, just the smallest softening in her jaw, a shift in the way she exhaled, and something fragile between them that didn't need to be defined yet. Behind them, the old trellis creaked, a slow wooden groan under the weight of something still growing. The building had been empty for 6 years. Its brick walls were cracked, windows dusty, one side still bearing the faded logo of Whitmore Rehabilitation West. Most saw it as an eyesore, a piece of corporate neglect left to rot behind liquor stores and shuttered laundromats. But not Elise. She stood in the main corridor with her sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind one ear, and a clipboard under her arm. Paint buckets lined the walls. From every room echoed the sound of life returning hammering, laughter, the tap of roller brushes along plaster. "Keep the blues on this side," she reminded a volunteer muralist, a high school junior who was painting a boy flying a kite. The light hit stronger in the morning here. Across the hall, Grant was on a ladder, realigning ceiling fans with a technician. His limp was still present, but he moved like a man who no longer noticed it. Instead of a suit, he wore a green work shirt with rolled sleeves and a name tag that simply read, Grant. They'd both declined press interviews. No reporters were allowed on opening day. Elise had said it simply, "We're not here to relive what happened. We're here to build what's next." The project had been her idea, at least publicly, but it was Grant who signed over the deed, redirected frozen funds, and offered one condition, that the center be named not after him, but after someone who had refused to stop speaking when no one else would. The Monroe Initiative. It wasn't a grand announcement, just a small metal plaque, hand-engraved, drilled and crooked, then adjusted by Grant himself with quiet care. Opening day felt nothing like a gala. There were no red carpets, just folding chairs, plastic cups of lemonade, and a crowd of over 100 people families, Former patients, young nurses, neighbors who thought the building was still abandoned. Inside the main room, now a makeshift therapy gym. Elise walked alongside a young girl named Mariah who had been recovering from a bike accident. "One step at a time," she said, gently encouraging. The girl's braces squeaked with each move. Mariah paused, looking up. "Where's Teacher Grant?" "He said he'd show me the trick to standing without holding the rail." Elise smiled, her voice soft. "He's right outside, fixing something." Mariah's face lit up. "Can I go say hi in a minute?" Elise said. "Let's show him how far you've come first." At that moment, through the back window, Elise caught a glimpse of Grant crouched down at the edge of the garden. The wind had knocked the Monroe Initiative sign slightly sideways. He was aligning it again, gently tapping it back into place with a rubber mallet. There was a slowness to his movements, not weakness, but intention, as if he understood what that name meant beyond metal and screws. She didn't call out to him, didn't need to. She turned back to Mariah and offered her her arm. Together, they stepped forward, and something settled in Elise's chest, not closure, not yet, but a kind of breathing space, a corner of the world reshaped by stubborn grace. The afternoon sun had cast a warm haze over the west wing of the rehabilitation center. Elise moved through the hallway with a calm, practiced over months, direct, steady, soft-spoken. 2 interns trailed behind her, each pushing a cart of sterilized tools. They had just finished arranging the stretching bands and checking the wheel locks on a set of walkers when she heard the burst of laughter from room 4B. It was a bright, high-pitched laugh, followed by a boy's voice shouting, "Daddy, look at this." Elise stopped. She wasn't the only one. The sound silenced the gentle buzz of conversation in the corridor. For a moment, the center held its breath. Elise turned and walked into the room. A small boy stood on one foot, balancing with both arms out like an airplane. His left leg was in a brace, but he didn't care. His smile could have lit up the block. He was looking at Grant, who was kneeling beside him, holding out a rubber ring like it was a trophy. "Daddy." "Did you see the boy beamed again?" Grant blinked. For a second. He didn't move. Elise watched his face, something passed through it. A stillness. A flicker of memory, or something deeper. Then a woman rushed in behind them, cheeks flushed. "I'm so sorry," she blurted, hands waving. "He calls every man who helps him daddy these days. He hasn't had one in years. Please, don't be upset." Grant stood slowly, placing the ring back on the cart. He bent down to the boy again and smiled gently. "That's okay, buddy. I'll take it as a compliment." Everyone laughed. Even the tension in the air softened, dissipated. Everyone except Elise. She stood back, hand resting on the frame of the open door. Her jaw still, her fingers curled slightly at her side. It wasn't the boy's voice that undid her. It was the way Grant responded. Not surprised, not uncomfortable, but familiar, natural, like someone who knew how to carry a name like that. After the session, Elise walked back to her small office behind the reception desk. The interns had left. The hallway had quieted to the usual end-of-day hush, broken only by distant footsteps and the soft hum of vending machines. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out the old notebook, the one she used to write in back when Grant was still in a hospital bed. It had been months since she touched it. Her fingers brushed over the cover before she flipped it open. Tucked between 2 pages was a sheet of paper she hadn't put there. The edges were slightly curled. The ink was firm, neat, unmistakably his. I heard every word. It read, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Her breath caught. For a long minute, she said nothing. Just traced the handwriting, line by line, over and over. Then, quietly, Elise reached for her wallet and slid the note inside, nestled next to an old photo of her mother, smiling on a summer bench, holding a paper fan. The day wore on. As she powered down her laptop, the screen dimmed and her reflection stared back, tired. A little older, but somehow more grounded than she remembered. Then her phone lit up. A video call from Mom. Elise answered. on the other end. The older woman's face filled the screen, her silver hair pulled back neatly, eyes lined but kind. "Elise, she began, her voice warm, familiar. "You've never told me, but I know. He's the one. Isn't he the one who made you believe again? In men. In love?" Elise didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened. Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, and in that pause, long, quiet, but brimming with what she hadn't yet said, the silence became its own kind of answer. The article came out on a Thursday. A grainy photo of Grant adjusting a child's crutch outside the rehab center took up most of the cover. The headline read, "From Hospital Bed to Hope Center, is Grant Whitmore a fallen heir or a rising prophet?" Underneath, in bold, "He gave up millions." But did he find something bigger Grant didn't read past the title? The pages felt like recycled questions wearing new fonts. Elise handed him the magazine, but he just folded it and tucked it into the desk drawer. "They always want to turn you into a story," he said, "even when you're still figuring out your own ending." Rumors snowballed. One morning, a lawyer from the Whitmore estate knocked on the door, a young man in a gray suit, stiff with politeness. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, "the board is requesting clarification on your intentions. If you're no longer involved in trust management and no longer occupying your father's estate office, they'd like to know where you stand." Grant listened, arms folded. The man hesitated. "There's concern about your recent affiliations, the foundation, the rehab center, the press attention. It's unconventional." Grant only said, "Tell them I still stand by the name, but not the chair." Later that evening, Elise caught him standing by the back garden, watching volunteers paint a mural flowers blooming from broken bricks. "You know," he said without turning, "if I stopped using the name Whitmore, they'd let me be. But that's not who you are," she said. "I don't know who I am," he said, "but I know who I'm not anymore." That weekend, the South Loop District hosted a small fundraising event. The community gathered in a converted church-turned center, filled with folding chairs, trays of finger food, and cheap wine in plastic cups. It wasn't glamorous, but it was full. The MC tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a man who's rewriting what legacy means in this city, Mr. Grant Whitmore." Grant walked onto the stage in a black button-up and jeans, no tie, no entourage. He paused, then stepped to the mic. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked around the room. People in hoodies, nurses in scrubs, retired teachers, kids with braces. Then he smiled softly. "Let's just call me Grant," he said. "That's enough name for tonight." The applause didn't erupt. It spread, quietly, warmly, like ripples from a stone dropped into water. Elise stood at the edge of the room, beside the projector. Her arms were crossed, but her face wasn't guarded. Her eyes met his, and held there long enough for the noise around them to blur. Later, as people packed up folding chairs and dimmed lights, she walked backstage to grab her jacket. That's when she saw Vivian standing there, in heels and a slate gray coat, framed by shadows and flickering overhead bulbs. "You've changed," Vivian said to Grant. Her voice was sharp but low. "Back then, you would have thanked me for protecting your seat, for protecting your image. Now you thank her." Grant didn't flinch. "You protected an illusion, not me." Vivian stepped closer. "You think walking away makes you free. You think letting go of Whitmore gives you Monroe." Grant didn't respond, but Elise saw it all. From a quiet corner, behind a half-pulled curtain. She saw how Vivian's shoulders rose, then fell. Saw Grant's silence. Saw his body turn just slightly, as if absorbing the weight of too many versions of himself. She didn't wait to hear more. She stepped out into the night, the air cool and full of streetlight haze. The city moved on, unbothered, unaware. But in her chest, something tightened. Not from jealousy, not from fear. Just a quiet reminder that even healed wounds remember how they broke. The community center in West Garfield Park was never meant to host a gallery. The lighting was uneven. The floors creaked. The walls still bore the marks of old bulletin boards and paint jobs that had never quite dried evenly. But on that day, it held something rarer than perfection: honesty. The first photo hung near the door. It was grainy, black and white, taken by a 7-year-old who had lost partial mobility after an accident. The image showed his grandmother holding onto a walker, sunlight catching the edge of her silver curls. Below it, he had scribbled in thick pencil, "She doesn't need to run, just to be beside me." The photos went on like that: a man adjusting his prosthetic, a teenage girl reaching toward parallel bars. 2 hands, one wrinkled, one smooth, locked in the frame of an open window. They weren't art students. They weren't trying to be profound. They just captured what recovery looked like when no one was watching. At the back of the room was the image Elise hadn't known would be there. It was her, kneeling beside a patient on a therapy bed, slipping a pillow beneath their knees, her head slightly bowed. The caption read, "The one who stayed." She stood in front of it longer than she meant to. The noise of the crowd faded into something soft and humming, like rain behind a closed window. Grant didn't say much that night. He walked the exhibit in silence, hands behind his back, nodding at children who had cameras hanging from their necks with yarn and tape. When he reached the back corner and saw the photo of Elise, he didn't pause, but his eyes did. They stayed longer than the rest of him. Near the end of the program, the event's host took the microphone. He was older, his voice like gravel rubbed smooth. "Before we close, I have one last announcement," he said, smiling faintly. "Next year's exhibit is already funded, a full renovation, a scholarship for youth photographers, all from a donor who asked not for attention, but permission to rename this very building." The crowd murmured, then hushed. The new name, effective next spring, will be the Monroe Center for Community Recovery. A wave of sound surged applause, shouts, scattered whistles, but Elise didn't move. Her breath caught in her throat. Somewhere across the room, she heard someone ask, why her name? Mr. Whitmore Grant stepped up beside the host, didn't take the mic, but turned toward the audience. "Because she gave me back my life," he said. "I'm just naming it properly." The applause rose again, but Elise had already turned, not to walk away, just to be alone with the feeling. Her eyes shimmered, and she blinked fast, not from embarrassment, but from how much it suddenly meant to be seen without needing to stand in the light. Later, the crowd thinned. Volunteers folded tables, unplugged string lights, and carried away empty cookie trays. Elise sat alone on the edge of the small stage, her shoes dangling over the floor, heels not touching wood. Grant approached without a sound. He sat next to her. For a while, they said nothing. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Not velvet, not gold, just plain cloth, worn at the corners. He opened it. Inside was a ring silver. Simple, quiet. "I'm not asking because I'm a Whitmore," he said. "I'm not asking because of anything I own. I'm asking because I'm a man who was healed by you." Elise looked down at the ring, then at him. She didn't say yes. She didn't say anything. But her fingers found his hand, curled into his, stayed there. The hall was smaller than the ones that hosted awards. The lighting was plain. The walls still smelled faintly of fresh paint and disinfectant. But for Elise, it was the only kind of ceremony that ever mattered. 3 kids, wide-eyed and fidgety, walked beside her down the newly opened wing of the Inglewood Clinic, each of them holding a little clipboard like it was a badge of honor. A nurse waved from reception. A few patients turned to smile as Elise passed. The space buzzed with low conversation, the sound of machines humming, and that calm rhythm of a place that knew what healing felt like, not just in the body, but in something quieter. Someone from the hosting committee caught up to her near the waiting room. "We thought Grant might be here," he said. "You two always show up as a pair." Elise smiled, brushing back a loose strand of hair. "He's probably cleaning up someone else's mess," she said gently. The man chuckled, as if she were joking, but Elise didn't laugh. She turned down a side hall. The lights were softer here, motion sensor bulbs kicking on as she stepped. And there, crouched in front of a long smudge of red paint that someone had tracked along the baseboard, was Grant. He was wearing an oversized volunteer apron. On the back, written in the thick black marker, were the words, "Property of Monroe." He didn't see her at first. He was focused, steady, scrubbing slowly, making sure not to miss the edges. When he glanced up, he didn't say a word, just offered a half smile that meant, "I didn't want this to wait till tomorrow." Elise didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. She leaned against the wall and watched him work. Her arms crossed, not closed, just full, a tug on her sleeve. She looked down. One of the little girls had returned, a folded piece of paper in hand. "I drew something," the girl said. "It's for the new patient room, so they're not scared." Elise unfolded the paper. It was a crayon drawing bright colors, soft lines. A rainbow stretched across the top. Below it stood two figures holding hands. One wore a long white coat. The other had a tool belt and a mop. "That's you," the girl said, pointing. "And that's Mr. Grant." Under the rainbow. Elise crouched, hugging her. "That's beautiful," she whispered. The girl skipped off, proud. Elise folded the drawing carefully and slid it into her coat pocket. Later that afternoon, back in her office, a tiny space behind the break room, Elise sorted through an old drawer. The clutter was familiar paperclips, expired pens, worn-out sticky notes. But at the very bottom, she found something she had forgotten. A letter. Still sealed, yellowed slightly at the corners. Her name written in careful, blocky letters. It was from her father. Postmarked 15 years ago. Before the sentencing. Before her mother passed. She sat down, slowly. Opened it. Most of it was scattered thoughts. Apologies written like a man unsure if he had the right. But one line, near the end, stood out. "If someone ever loves you for who you are not, who you were, don't let your past stop you from believing again." Elise closed her eyes. The page trembled just a little in her hand. She folded it back, set it gently on her desk, then stood. When she returned to the hallway, Grant was still there. He'd finished scrubbing, was packing up the bucket. She came close, didn't speak, just looked at him. He looked back, no questions in his eyes, only space, a kind of peace that had taken both of them years to grow into. She stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder. He covered it with his. They didn't speak vows. They didn't frame it in promises. But in that moment, with paint still fresh on the walls and a child's rainbow in her pocket, Elise understood something final. They didn't need to match. They just needed to face the same direction. Some names never make it to the front page. Some stories never trend. But in a quiet hallway, where laughter echoes off faded walls and a volunteer wipes paint from a child's elbow, something honest begins. He didn't reclaim a legacy. She didn't erase the past. But they built something steadier with time, with hands that stayed open. Not every scar fades. Not every answer comes loud. But maybe the truest kind of love isn't about fixing what broke. Maybe it's just this being seen and still being chosen.